You're listening to Food Tech Talk, Supply Chain Insights from Farm to Fork, a podcast discussing the latest trends and technology in the food and supplement industries, featuring conversations with regulatory experts, quality and safety champions, and thought leaders across the industry. I'm your host, Lydia Adams. Let's jump right in. Welcome to Food Tech Talk, Supply Chain Insights from Farm to Fork. Today, we're delighted to welcome Eric Moore, a passionate food safety and quality assurance professional with extensive experience in developing risk-based food safety management programs, and who is currently the Director of Food Safety and Industry Outreach at Testo Solutions North America, where he pioneers technology-enabled approaches to managing risk factors. His career includes key roles at Acme Markets, Aramark, and Compass Group North America, highlighting his expertise in leveraging technology for food safety and compliance. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to get to join the podcast, and I look forward to our chat.
Yeah, certainly. And I know that we've had you on in the past, so I'm really excited to talk about what's new. But to kick us off, for those that may not know you, maybe you can share a little bit more about your journey in the food safety industry. What inspired you to focus on digital food safety management systems in particular?
I have been, I would say, somewhat fortunate over the span of my now 20 plus year career. I got into food safety, I don't want to necessarily say by accident, but it's an interesting situation. Very different pathway for me than I think a lot of people. In the early 2000s, when I got into food safety, there really wasn't much of, there's no like educational track per se, except for the collegiate level, really except for like food scientists, right? So if you were going to be like developing flavors and things like that, a lot of universities had career paths in majors like that. Interestingly, I actually went to school for hospitality. And in doing that, that's where part of my background, when I was right after college working for Aramark, I worked at a couple of their higher education institutions, and I kind of got homesick, I guess you could say. Like I was living and working in New York City at the time, and I wanted to relocate back to the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania region, which is primarily where I grew up, and, friends and family were in that region. So I ended up transferring internally within the company into their sports and entertainment division. And that's when this pivot, in my experience happened from being a hospitality manager to being a designated food safety person. So it was one of those situations where I wasn't necessarily getting thrown into the fire, just because given my background, I had some food safety understanding and training and things like that, running dining halls in restaurants and things like that. But it was a pretty big shift in that I went to work at the Pennsylvania Convention Center, which at the time was one of the 4 largest convention centers in the country. And it was always busy, but 80% of the year it had stuff going on. And then interestingly, Aramark controlled all of the largest convention centers in the country at the time. I don't know if they still do that or not, but when I had downtime at my convention center, I would get shipped off to other places to do event-driven food safety work. And that's where things got really interesting. Fortunately for me, at the time, I had a really good mentor. He was the senior most executive chef within that pillar of business within Aramark. And he was very food safety savvy, given the fact that we're managing events, we're serving 10,000 people for dinner, right? A plated dinner. Like you have to take a lot of things into consideration, right? He really saw the value in investing in my experience and knowledge. It also was nice. He was kind of I don't want to say like a techie, like geeky nerd, but he liked to try new things, right? Whether that's creating different menu items, which he obviously always did, but it was also understanding new pieces of equipment that might make his culinary team's jobs easier. And he included me into that scope. And what started as try this, electronic thermometer actually at the time turned into a company had reached out to him to start to test. It was called a HACCP manager. So it was like this huge, big, clunky thermocouple that you could pre-program specific actions into it. And it used these little like tags that if you put the device up, you sort of held the device up in a certain way to them, almost similar to an NFC tag in today's tech world, that you could identify that specific tag with either a specific place or a specific product. So I began, and this is going back to 2000, I began using electronic temperature monitoring and keeping food storage and final cooking and holding logs in an electronic format quite a long time ago. And things just sort of like blossomed from there because the back and forth that I was able to provide to the company that was developing this led them, down a lot of really interesting paths into how to make the device better, smarter, smaller, quick, faster response times and, try to bring the price down and things like that. So it was a really interesting experience going back better part of 20 plus years now and being able to have information available. And essentially everything was downloaded into an Excel spreadsheet. I began to just start playing with all this stuff. And, if it was making reports or like trying to create a graph, it all just sort of blossomed out of that opportunity. And every role that I then subsequently had after that, that just got to be more and more of a focal point within what I was doing. Whether that be a regional food safety manager, that I covered several thousand accounts for Compass Group and being able to having the base level understanding of how data or information in Excel document can be used to represent information back to people working in the business and tying in some visual pieces became a huge part of everything that I tried to do and everything that the departments that at the time I was working within were trying to leverage as well, because it's a lot easier to tell a story with some pictures or a pie graph or a bar graph than it is to run through an Excel document, and say, oh, well, here's where you didn't cook something long enough or to the right temperature. People seem to be able to digest it a lot easier when they can have some sort of visual cue. And that experience and being able to do that also opened up a lot of area of opportunity for me to understand, because at the time in all those roles, we had companies like mine, a service provider, right? We had service providers that had the capability to provide us with electronic reports, or they could send me or somebody else on whatever team I was on information in a sortable format. So we began to look at, all right, well, from our audit company, how can we start to dissect this information in a different manner and do trending across different restaurant concepts or brands in different districts and managers and things like that? So everything sort of blossomed just out of this little opportunity. And it's obviously still got a lot of road ahead of it. We're still, I would say in the digital food safety space, we're still like in the infancy of where things are headed.
I mean, I'd love to talk about that because I feel like you've shared sort of that pivotal milestone moment where you switched over to really that technology focus and you've seen a lot of things change. So we've come a long way. What are the things that you've seen that have major advancements in this area, and how does that align to your experience in terms of digital food safety management systems?
One thing I'll add in there, a lot of this, it was a very self-centered, selfish thing that I was doing because I knew once I started using some of these tools, I knew how much time it was saving me because I could spend 2.5 to 3 hours walking around an establishment writing refrigeration logs, or I could understand how to get that information that's being collected from, some type of reporting system, and I give myself back 2.5 to 3 hours where I could be focusing on more important things. I think, to state probably the obvious, the most important improvement in the last, say, 15 to 20 years has been cost being lowered. Cost of whatever it is, whether it's a digital thermometer, whether it's a stationary temperature monitoring device, any kind of sensor technology. 25 years ago, a digital thermometer, you were going to spend $500-600 for a pretty low level, like not a lot of function thermocouple. Now you can buy, it's just like with our phones, right? Like you can buy a more advanced device that's a third the size and it's $150. It's pretty wild. And I think, like, in all honesty, like that is the biggest advancement because the cost savings or the lower the cost of these devices now begin to break down the barriers of adoption. Even if somebody just wants to adopt certain pieces of equipment or certain types of technology, what was potentially an insurmountable amount of investment capital that would be needed, it is reduced drastically. And to state the other obvious thing is just how far software functionality has come and where it's heading. You can't have your phone in your hand or your TV on or listening to a podcast like this without somebody talking about advanced analytics or AI and machine learning and things like that. And those devices they've just continued to lead ways for software systems, like compliance-based software platforms, to become better and more functional. And it's just going to get better. I often tell people that I really think we're kind of in this golden age of food safety, which kind of got kicked off with the new era of smarter food safety. I really think in 20 years, that's how people are going to be looking at this. It's almost, if you think back to Upton Sinclair type of moment, what he wrote, even though it wasn't intended to create a federal agency, it ended up creating a federal agency, and I think what's happening now is really writing the story for how human society is going to be able to better manage, whether it's food safety, food insecurity, food access, all those things. It's an exciting time. It's a little overwhelming at times, but it's exciting.
Yeah, it's certainly, and it feels like there is that turning point. But I think what you mentioned previously about adoption is also really important because we can have these tools in front of us and these ways to kind of go beyond that compliance and really embrace where we are with that new era of food safety. How have you pushed that adoption in the organizations that you've been working towards so that you can be a leader in both food safety and adopting technology?
So what I did, I said before, it was very selfishly motivated. And in all honesty, like sometimes I was in, my roles where there were huge obstacles, mainly IT obstacles that completely limited my ability to use any kind of tool. And that gets into a pretty big, messy legal, litigation discussion that we don't really need to go down that path. But even in places where I was not allowed to say, use an app or pay for a subscription for, an app, I still would kind of work my way around those things. And, my one role I used, it was like a free app. I don't even know if it still exists, but you could build your own audit on your phone. And basically what I did, because there was more value in capturing the information when I would go to, one of these grocery stores or something and spend 4 hours walking around talking to employees and making observations of how they were following, policies and procedures and things like that. After that visit is done, I know that I need to be able to do something with that information. Some of this is like at times, based on my background, I don't necessarily have the highest level of trust in operators at all times, because unfortunately, a lot of times, like when I was doing auditing, right? Like you walk in and people are like, man, that guy's here, right? Like you become the food police and people don't really like that. So using these pieces of technology, I always try to blend in methods to not make everything a gotcha or a negative from an auditing perspective, and being able to record that somewhere rather than just write it on some piece of paper that you're filling out like with the little black, whatever, the carbon paper. So it's getting filled out in triplicate and stuff. Being able to use that after you leave and share that with that store manager or that department manager's boss, right? These are the things that they were doing really well. These are the things that they need to sort of do a little bit better. that's where I think a lot of area of value can be pulled out of these things. And I still try to ensure that is taken into consideration because that gets into the cultural values of an organization, right? You don't want everything to always be, punitive and negative. Even when you're looking at like accountability models, there's positive forms of that and there's negative forms of accountability. In, being able to have those weigh out is good.
Going into, another aspect that you had mentioned about data analytics and AI, and as we think about how the technology is currently evolving, not just the past, where do you see that playing a role in the future? And how can professionals use that to improve food safety?
I think data is important, right? There's really good information that's out there and understanding how to use it, right? So you avoid one of the trash in, trash out scenarios, which historically is all that we did. We just wrote things on paper and then they wound up in a drawer. If you don't know how to access the information that's being documented in an electronic format, you're doing the exact same thing. You're just doing it on a different platform. I think where the value really comes into play is when you're able to tie what you're measuring, right? These specific data points into how they better support the business. So it's kind of like this ROI idea or statement. I think a good example that I share, or I've been sort of saying it for, as long as I've been in this role, is that if an organization, or a location adopts automated stationary temperature monitoring, and I'll use the example earlier, when I worked at a convention center, I could spend 3 hours a day walking around doing that. So that's 3 hours a day for a salaried manager to just walk around with a pen in their hand, writing a temperature on a piece of paper. When you take that action away, that gives that person more time. And I said it earlier, to focus on better things, right? So you can focus on better risks, or you can actually get into better risk management practices, right? You can start watching people wash their hands. And if you need to interrupt them and do some educational reinforcement, it enables you to have that opportunity. So just that one simple thing, right? Not requiring people to write down temperatures, right? It enables that individual, depending on what their role is, to spend more time interacting with their customers, which is a big deal. And if you have and let's just hypothetically say, like our sales team is speaking to a potential customer, if they're able to identify, okay, well, what's this department's, what are their sales like over the last, pick a time frame, right? And then when you draw a line in the sand, and from that day forward, they were using some sort of technology supporting tool, you can kind of correlate or begin to correlate. That's how I can legitimately justify this expense back to my business, because I'm now selling more hot rotisserie chickens, right? Because I have time to cook more, or I have more time to pay attention to the temperatures that they're getting cooked to. And I'm producing a better product because I don't have to worry about this other stuff. I think that's huge, is being able to correlate those types of minute little details.
And it speaks to sort of that efficiency of what you can do with these tools with AI. You need a human to have a relationship with your customer, but then there's these other things that are taking that person away from building the business. So I think that's a really important part when we talk about food safety is the ROI, because we do this for many reasons and we're all very passionate about food safety. But then, on the other side, it's also really great to see these other benefits of to the bottom line of the business.
Exactly. And you bring up another piece. I think they're soft benefits. The ROI piece, that's almost, if you do it right, that can be an absolute, like a hard benefit, which can justify, right, a company going down this investment pathway, because it's a big deal. It's a big change. Depending on the size of the organization, it can be a massive change management initiative. It touches lots of departments, lots of jobs, and things like that, both in good and bad ways. Two of the other really big benefits. One is, it's a concept that I like to call exception-based management. where the days of running around like chicken with its head cut off, trying to manage everything all at once, these systems, right, they begin to take the place of those eyes that are supposed to be watching over whether it's, your critical limits or your control procedures or in things like that. And then the only time the system says anything is when it identifies or records something that is out of spec. And then someone is notified and they're like, oh, I got to go do this, right? Because historically, you might run into situations where you would have what another term I like to throw around is called alarm fatigue. And a good example, and I don't know why I keep referring to this Aramark job so much, but there's so many good examples. So the convention center that I was housed out of, it had audible siren on a door contact that if the doors left open for like 20 minutes, it would go off. There was also like a light, right? This red flashing light that would go off 50 times a day, and nobody paid any attention to it because they became fatigued. It was no longer an actionable insight. That piece of equipment was trying to tell them how you programmed me, something's wrong. And the systems that are available today, they're engineering that type of fatigue so that when the system does tell you something, I better get my butt in gear. I got to go look at what's going on here because there's potential risk involved.
And then, looking at when this alarm fatigue is happening, I think that's a great point. So, the real-time monitoring is also a factor because is this an issue right now at this moment, and having people understand what needs action on it versus what is, more of a notification. And I think that plays into what you were talking about with everything's an emergency. So how does that help to get people in the right mindset of prioritization with these types of incidents?
I think being able to communicate or align around that methodology is important because it takes a village to raise kids. And it's the same type of scenario when trying to implement one of these systems, when you're creating what Testo calls a workflow, whether it's automated or it requires some sort of action, like answering a question, you need the operator's input in how that gets created because it does a couple of things, right? It helps integrate it into their daily, how they work in their department to begin with, right? So, which is important. And that kind of gets into how do you do this successfully in 2,000 stores, right? Like, how do you even think of approaching something like that, right? You have to make it easy. It's like that thing, keep it simple. It's hard to keep things simple, but the investment in time and communication up front leads to success later down the road. And being able to make, however, the employees or the operators are going to be interacting with the system and the actions involved, however that can get input with the least amount of change is huge. So maybe it's in a grocery store. A lot of them use these handheld devices that you've probably seen them. They look like Star Trek laser gun things, right? Those are they're quite sophisticated pieces of equipment. They do all of their inventory, all of their ordering, and those systems, they can actually help convey training information and all kinds of other things. So you have this massive amount of people within an organization. They spend the whole day with this thing in their hand. If your system can get integrated into that, you've just made their life a lot easier because they don't have to learn some other new tool. And if you're able to do that well, then they're just like, oh yeah, this is awesome. This is great. The information that I've heard, we get very little feedback around like adoption hesitancy or the adoption curve, within an organization. But the user adoption, it's not that hard. We live on our phones, and whether it's somebody's using a tablet, a mobile device, or some other tool that is already in their business, integrating into that is an easy way to make things simple.
So I wanted you to also touch on IoT because I know that you are, an expert in that, and that has so much potential for food safety. So How do you feel like that can be used as a way to basically improve operational efficiency in this area?
It's interesting. The whole IoT topic, like I said, being able to connect or present a system in employees like native is close to their native, operating environment is huge. So any way that can be done, I think it's a win. Where some of the challenges around IoT begin to show up is it kind of gets into a bigger discussion. New pieces of commercial equipment are all being integrated with various different sensor capabilities, right? Whether that's Bluetooth, LoRaWAN, radio, whatever. And every manufacturer, commercial equipment manufacturer, they've all got their own software. They've all got their own stuff. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them, right? But if you look at the industry, how frequently is a establishment going to buy a new fryer that costs $80,000? Not very often. They are going to keep the one as long as they possibly can until it like blows up or catches on fire, right? So when you're looking at IoT sensors, a lot of the discussion becomes focused around aftermarket sensor capabilities, being able to provide key pieces of data around, whether it's refrigeration temperatures or it's equipment, lifespan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? The hard part of all of that is it gets into the communication protocols. And our company actually began to realize this 4 years ago, and we made a very distinct change where our digital food safety management system, our stationary data loggers, when we first developed and brought them to market, they were all communicating via Wi-Fi. And the problem there is that every single one of those devices, which can change with any establishment size, they are each potential breach points from an IT security perspective. And each one of those, they have to get whitelisted on the company's Wi-Fi network, and it becomes a real challenge. And as more and more sensors enter into an establishment, the same thing is occurring, right? Ensuring that each one of these sensors, whatever they might do, even the little credit card machine, like how that's communicating, is important because there's only so much bandwidth within an establishment. And you don't want to be the company that's selling the sensor. That's where a hacker comes in through your communication channel on their network and costs somebody, and creates a situation. So we actually completely revamped our stationary monitoring capabilities and went from Wi-Fi to radio. So switching from, what could be 30 or 40 different stationary temperature data loggers needing Wi-Fi access, we have one place that needs wireless access, or we prefer actually to use a hardwired LAN access, and you drastically reduce the potential for weak points within an IT infrastructure within an establishment. So that's something is exciting, is all the IoT things are. It's something that sort of lurks underneath the surface that once a company starts having these discussions, that's the first thing that an IT department, they'll blow up a discussion faster than anything else, right? Because it's huge. But being able to understand the basic communication protocol requirements, I think is important. It's kind of one of those feathers that you can have in your hat as a food safety professional. Like when you start shopping around for systems like this, what kind of IT considerations are there, right? If we're going to try to have all of our refrigerators communicating data in real time, well, what's the easiest pathway? Identifying that with your IT department before you get too far down any kind of discussion pathway. But more and more sensors are being brought into establishments, whether it's related to temperature, humidity. There are a lot of organizations that sell like leak detection devices. I think in the somewhat near future, there's going to be organizations that are starting to explore the use of like optical imagery, as data collection points, not like spying per se on people. I really think there's a massive opportunity for them. And I think a couple of pest control companies have tried this, but if you're able to have an optical image sensor positioned in certain places, like in a, say, like a dry storeroom or whatever. And the software that is sort of programmed into that sensor can know what a rat looks like or a mouse or, certain, like maybe given a geography, what the likelihood of certain kind of flying pests or crawling pests could be in that establishment. Like that's huge, is an early warning sign. But yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more areas of IoT connectivity as we move forward. It's just a question of how much is too much. And even what can companies, from a cost perspective, what can they withstand? And what risk is it really going to be able to control? My opinion is if you can positively answer those questions and it's not astronomical cost, it could be a pretty awesome adventure.
That's really great advice in terms of interacting with IT at the very forefront of these conversations. What other advice do you have for those that are looking to really upgrade their food safety and using these tools? What would you tell them today?
I guess the one thing I think is the most important is, and this is just, it's how my brain works. And it's how I've approached things, whether it's writing a 600-page food safety management program for a company, or it's talking to organizations that are exploring the use of digital food safety management. Have a very good idea of what you want in the end and make it aspirational is all get out, because at some point, almost anything is going to be possible. And the benefit of knowing what is your gold standard, what is your Shangri-La, right? That then enables you as a potential customer and the organization or organizations that you're speaking to begin to reverse engineer. How do we get there? Because not knowing what you want, when you start discussing and shopping, if you don't have a clear understanding or a good end goal, it can lead to disparate activities that aren't going to be able to funnel all into, a centralized system in the way that, I think a lot of people hope or envision that things will be able to do. So I think that is, the most important piece. And then you get it right. And then you get into, okay, well, we got to get funding and you got to get operations involved and you got to get purchasing involved and you got to get IT has to have a seat at the table. And how are we going to do this? Oh, HR's got to get involved because we're going to have to create a whole training component to this. But having a very clear understanding of what the endpoint is, which there's really no true endpoint, right? Because technology is advancing faster now than it ever has. What's the saying? It's advancing faster now than it ever has. It also the slowest it's going to be. So it's a little bit of foresight, but the way I try to get people to understand that is literally what would be perfect. What is your image of perfect? And then as we discuss when we start to reverse kind of engineer the pieces of that, we can say, okay, well, this is realistic now, and we might be able to do this then. And this is something that's really cool. That doesn't even exist. That's going to be on the side burner. But it's also having a realistic rollout time frame. I would say that in my, I think is a big aspect for people to consider too. These systems create a lot of change. And it could take 2 to 3 years for something like this to roll out for very large brands, right? Others, smaller organizations, maybe it'll only take a year, something like that. But you don't want to try and do it too fast because then you could run the risk of creating more challenges than might be necessary. Industry insight, talk to other people, talk to other organizations. If they were maybe a company that, has been using, systems like this for a long time, if you were to start over, what lessons did you learn, that you could take and make things different or better in your opinion? That would be a good thing to consider.
This is great advice. So, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I know that I learned a lot, our listeners learned a lot. So, really appreciate your time and sharing that insight with us.
This has been great. For anybody that doesn't know, I'm very active in the Conference for Food Protection, which is an organization where industry, regulatory, academia, and consumer advocacy all come together and they discuss and they recommend changes or improvements to the FDA model food code. So that meeting happens every 2 years. And the conference actually has working groups that are given projects that are to get completed between the meetings. So, and the reason I bring this up is the next conference is in 2025. It's in March, later March. It's going to be held in Denver. It is where industry has a seat at the table to influence how they're regulated. So for anybody that's never heard of it, please look it up, email me, text me, whatever. I'm happy to explain more. There's a lot more with it and behind it. That's what I wanted to plug for the Conference for Food Protection.
Absolutely. So what's the web address? Where can people go to find it? Or how should they look up more info?
Foodprotect.org. That's the website. If you just Google Conference for Food Protection, you'll find it. It's pretty unique.
Fantastic. That sounds like a really great opportunity. Well, thanks again, Eric. Really appreciate it and hope we get to chat again.
Thanks again, Lydia. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for another bite-sized nugget of food tech talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork. To learn more about Trustwell and its technology platform that connects product formulation, nutrition analysis, and compliant labeling with traceability, recall readiness, and supply chain transparency, please visit www.trustwell.com. Thanks for listening.